Okay, I'm Andy Shiers, I'm the COO of Dyalog. This is yet another of my Fireside chats. I think this might be the first one since 2019, so quite a lot has happened since then. But I'm not going to keep you here all night whilst I talk about all those things. So the agenda, quick word about Geoff, something about testing, some announcements and some miscellaneous stuff. And also, after Morton kindly stitched me up yesterday by telling me that I was going to mention that I was going to talk about one or two things, I've added a couple of extra slides since then. So first of all, Geoff, Morton and Geeta both mentioned that he retired this year. I've had the pleasure of working with Geoff for 36 years, and I've known him for longer than that. And Geoff is possibly the most well-read man I've ever come across, and a charming bloke as well. Geoff, however, isn't necessarily quite on the same wavelength as the rest of us. He thinks differently. And a little story to indicate that is that in the early days, the offices for Dyalog were based in Alton, which is 20 miles away from Basingstoke, and both he and I had to travel every morning down the road from Odium to Alton to get to work. Now the problem was that the school bus did this, and school buses in the UK are not very new. And this one was particularly ancient, and we still maintain that the kids sitting downstairs had to put their feet through the floor and run to get them up the hill. But it was slow. So if you saw the bus in front of you, you kind of gave up to a certain extent, because on the way, there were few places to overtake. You could do it, if you're lucky, down past RAF Odium. You could overtake south of South Warnborough, and you could overtake, if you're very lucky and a bit brave, if you went up the hill or down the hill from the Golden Pot pub. You could actually overtake just as you went into Alton, but by that point you were so fed up you couldn't be bothered. That's what the vast majority, no, all but one person thought. Geoff, on the other hand, Geoff was a motorcyclist, and he was happy to abort an overtaking manoeuvre. He also worked for a council in West London before he joined Dyalog, where he studied traffic flow. And on one occasion he explained to me that not only was he happy to abort an overtaking manoeuvre, but he knew that traffic flow followed a Poisson distribution, and therefore he could make some attempt to predict when it would be safe to overtake. You saw Geoff in front of you, or more scarily, you saw Geoff behind you, and you dropped back to leave a bigger distance, improve your braking distance, and you waited to see what happened. Well, thankfully, nothing ever did happen on the road. However, Pete Donnelly, the managing director of Dyalog at the time, and we were a subsidiary of a company called Linwood, would frequently bump into the owners of Linwood, and the conversation, I am told, went something like, "Mr. Donnelly, my compliments to Mr. Streeter. Could you explain to him that that is a company car and it costs us money?" And Pete then said that the conversation generally went on for a few more minutes. I say conversation, I'm assured it was a monologue. Pete didn't get a chance to put a word in edgeways. I make a little bit of fun of Geoff, but there is no doubt that without Geoff Streeter, none of us would be here today. Dyalog APL would not exist. So please, when you next have a glass in your hand, raise a glass to him and wish him a long and happy retirement. Right, now on with, oh yes, matters arising. Yeah, let's destroy my thought process and my presentation. Matters arising. Ron mentioned that he was using something like a 7 gigabyte workspace on his Pi. I'm aware that some of our customers use 20 gigabyte workspaces. We have a box in the office that's now got 256 gig of memory. I haven't yet tried using it, but I've been up to 100, I think back to 96 so far. However, since my last presentation, I would like to say that I have seen or been aware of someone running a 2 terabyte workspace, and that is in memory, that is not swapping out. So Dyalog APL has managed to use a 2 terabyte workspace. It didn't do anything more than create an array and then add it up to itself, but it worked. It took a long time, but it worked. So we have got some room for expansion, and we know it will work. Brian mentioned HttpCommand, and since I'm talking about big numbers, I'd just like to say that last week I was attempting to plan for doing an upgrade to our bug reporting system, and due to somewhat poor quality programming on my part, I had a single APL process that called HttpCommand 500,000 times, worked like a dream. So I can strongly recommend that you use HttpCommand to get information in particular, which is what I was doing, but I was also updating the database at the same time. I originally started out this job using curl at the command line in Linux, but HttpCommand with the get JSON option, it is so much easier to handle API information that's in JSON format in APL than it could be in almost anything else I know. I am not an APL programmer. I merely use APL as a tool in my armory, and in this case, APL blows the opposition away, in my opinion. Finn this morning made a very good point. Finn, Karen's not here. Finn will be getting a good boy sticker from Karen. I will recommend it. You get those at Dyalog if you've been particularly good, and Finn gets one. Our containers we publish are for demo and development purposes only. If you want to use them in production, please talk to your IT department and create your own containers. We're happy to give you some guidelines and help that sort of thing, but they should set it up because they then can make sure it matches your security requirements. And more to the point, if your company or your IT department gets audited, they can hand on heart say, we know what's in that container. And it makes life an awful lot easier. And quite frankly, we don't want to be responsible for the security of your containers. Other thing you can do, you install Dyalog APL in a container, but there's no reason why you shouldn't strip bits out of it. So you probably don't need the help in a container, you don't need the workspaces, you don't need the samples. You can reduce the size of the installation footprint quite considerably. We haven't actually written anything up about this. I think we will do in the near future, but effectively you don't need very much to be able to run Dyalog APL in the container, so why not get rid of the rest of it, and it will speed up startup time and such like. Right, now back to my original presentation. So testing, I've spoken before about our standard QAs and our shuffle QAs. Richard spoke about how pockets get moved around and pointers that point to pockets have to move as well. And what the shuffle QAs do is every single time you effectively create a new pocket, it moves every single existing pocket one word to the left or right, and then checks that the pointers have moved correctly. So it's a great way of making sure that new code is capable of surviving being moved. We have some code coverage QAs. It's fairly early days on some of this stuff. We run it on Linux. But Arush has come on board and he's looking more and more into this sort of stuff. He's also going to work on a complete new generation of QAs. So we have our existing QAs and he's going to start on a new set for us. And the final thing that we're doing with testing is fuzz testing. So here's a question, actually 5 questions. What do these expressions do, other than make it something that I can show to indicate words of displeasure when talking about Geoff Streeter? So here are some expressions. What I will say is these expressions are brilliant for showing the benefits of the token by token tracing. Because if you're trying to work out what those expressions are doing, TBT doesn't half make it easier. Well, the answer to your question is, they all killed the interpreter until recently. And this is what the fuzz tests are looking for, expressions that do nasty things to the interpreter. And we run them continually, not continuously. Continuously means that we're using the same interpreter. Continually means we run it all the time. And effectively, twice a week, we rebuild the interpreter with special flags and then start the fuzz test for 3 days or 4 days. And it uses a technique called American Fuzzy Lop. If you search that on the internet, you'll get an awful lot of hits about rabbits, because that's what it's named after. And in round terms, it finds expressions of interest. You seed the process with a set of expressions, and it kind of wanders around and says, oh, that looks a bit interesting, and follows that down, and then finds problems, and then concentrates and works its way down there. So far, since we started the fuzz testing, we've done about 2 E11 expressions. I use that horrible syntax because I then have to worry about what a billion means. And it finds failures. It finds expressions that run too long. Now, the big problem here is that as far as AFL is concerned, or an AFL interpreter, too long means a few microseconds, which if you've got a recursive defun, it's guaranteed to throw it out. we're doing something about that in the debug interpreters to give me something to find those, and possibly for waiting on input. So having got all of these expressions, and we've so far built up a library of about 40,000 expressions. That sounds a lot, but an awful lot of them fail because of timing issues. And if it finds 1 plus quote A quote is a problem, it will probably find 1 plus quote B quote. And by the time it gets about 1 plus quote H quote, it'll give up and say, I think I've made my point. And then we investigate all the errors. Well, that's not entirely true. We start investigating the more frequently happening ones because there's still some work to be done on this. And we eliminate the bugs. And Peter gets a special round of applause from me for the number of those issues he's fixed. I think Silas is number 2 on the list, and the rest of the development team have done their fair share as well. So 19.0, we started this with 18.2 really, but 19.0 has a lot of fixes for what appear to be really bizarre expressions. So what? Here, this is onto quad NINFO. And so I've got 40,000 expressions, and I run them against each of the interpreters we've got. So that's 4 on Windows, 4 on AX, 2 on Linux, 1 on Mac Intel, 1 on Mac ARM, 1 on Pi. Those are the optimized builds. We also have the debug build, so that's 26 interpreters. So I run 40,000 expressions times 26, each of them in their own process. On Mac, that takes 7.5 hours. On Windows, that takes 3 hours and 12 minutes. Sorry, 3 days and 12 hours. 7.5 hours, 3.5 days. So it takes a bit of time to run this. And at the end of it, it generated on the last run about 78,000 files that I had to look at. And what I want is a list of those files so that I can then go and work out what the expression was, the frequency of them, what the problem was. And when I did that in August, shall we say, making the numbers up here, that took 149 seconds for my laptop to run a recursive quad NINFO to our file system. Note, never use recurse 1. It's useless. It's like quad SH. If quad SH gets a problem, it domain errors. If you use recurse 1, it finds any problem at all, it domain errors, and you get no information. Recurse 2 reports all the files that it can find, and if you use the correct arguments to left argument to quad NINFO, it will tell you useful things like, I couldn't read into this, so you can find that you must have missing entries. So 149 seconds. If you use version 18.2.47791 or 19.0 equivalent thereof, quad NINFO is faster on Windows. It brings it into line with the performance on other platforms. So, running it a couple of weeks ago with a much more recent version of Dyalog APL, well, more recent 19 anyway, it took 5 seconds. So the improvement is from 149 seconds to 5 seconds. That is not just on the recursive option on quad NINFO, it's on quad NINFO in almost every case on Windows. Huge thanks to Stefano at SimCorp Italiana for suggesting the improvement. I'd been whinging about this for years. He pointed out that it was slow, but he had the kindness to actually point out the improvement we could make. So again, thanks to Stefano for suggesting the improvement. And if you found that quad NINFO has been slow in the past, do give it another go. It's a lot faster. Oh, it's Uncle Andy's Fireside chat. He's got some announcements. So some withdrawals and some things about 19.0. So first of all, we're withdrawing the R interface. It has been withdrawn in version 19. The main reason being that the code we relied on, the bridging code effectively, is no longer publicly, well, the current version that's publicly available is out of date, and the maintainers have no interest in making more recent versions available to us. So our interface is gone. If you want something to replace it, use Chemolina's rserv. I have checked, it is called rserv, but the URL is to RConnect. Those of you who were in Portugal last year may remember that Chemo gave a presentation from Brussels Airport, having flown a plane in and was about to fly a plane out, so a very clever man. We are withdrawing an iBeam. Every time I do this presentation, I put the slide up, which will come later, which says things about iBeams, but I think this may be the first main one we've ever withdrawn. 819 iBeam will not be present in 20.0. You must use Quad C instead. The arguments are slightly different. Be aware that if you use it monadically, or use the -3 as the left argument, which is what we recommend that you use for caseless comparisons, then it folds characters. For those languages that use A to Z, 0 to 9 and nothing else, the next slide is meaningless almost to you. But basically, if for example you look at the Greek word Odysseus, one of the heroes of ancient Greece, if the word is not all uppercase, then the last letter, which is a sigma, and the last letter is sigma, as are those two. But if it's at the end of the word, you use a different glyph. And what folding does, effectively, is to fold them down onto the same character, which makes caseless comparisons much more sensible. So, if you are using quad C, there's a typo for you, isn't there? If you're using quad C, use it monadically is the recommendation. If you use quad C on classic, why are you using classic? If you are using quad C on classic, you can type quad C, quad AV, and convert all of the characters to lowercase. If you try one quad C, quad AV, convert everything to uppercase, you will get a translation error because quad AV in classic does not contain the uppercase equivalent of all the lowercase letters. So, benefits of quad C. Number 1, you have no choice. It does not error if any of the elements are not character. So if you used 819 iBeam, you had to either put a trap around it, or you had to check that all the elements, no matter how horribly nested or depth or ranked this object was, you had to check all the elements were character before you called it. But quad C just ignores, just returns, passes through any non-character elements. So in this case, it's going to fold to lowercase, Andy. There's a reference, just return it. There's a matrix, return that folded. Here's a floating point number, return that as well, folded. Sorry, untouched. Refs are not followed, but they're merely just returned unaltered. So quad C, you've got to get rid of 819 iBeam. Quad C has benefits, in my opinion. We have removed the array editor for 19.0, and that's sadly because David Liebtag has passed away last March, I believe, so no one's maintaining it. Future plans, we think, will be based on the array notation, and that's the sum total of the future planning so far. And the final thing of the withdrawals, Syncfusion. We've included Syncfusion libraries with the Windows version of Dyalog APL for quite a few versions now, but we're going to stop doing so in 20.0. We don't feel that that many people use it. It means also that our Syncfusion support agreement will terminate next September. Having said that, we have always said that should you use Syncfusion libraries in your production code, you should take out a contract directly with Syncfusion. If you're already using Syncfusion in conjunction with version 19.0 or earlier, well, you won't be doing 19.0 since we haven't released it yet. With 19.0 or earlier, you may continue to use Syncfusion. You may not use Syncfusion with version 20 without getting a contract with them directly. If you've got any more questions about that, send an email to sales or have a word with one of the admin team. Yeah. I wonder why this slide appeared here last night. So, 32-bit versions of Dyalog APL are currently available on Windows, AIX and Pi only. We'd like to get rid of them for the reasons that Morten explained yesterday. I think the Pi version is most likely to remain, probably until we feel that 32-bit Raspberry Pi OS has too few users. You can run a 32-bit version of Raspberry Pi OS on a 32-bit Pi or a 64-bit Pi, and we feel that quite a few people are still doing so. The 32-bit version of Dyalog APL does not run on 64 Raspberry Pi OS. Given it a try, can't get it to work. And the reason is that Raspberry Pi OS doesn't have the conversion libraries necessary to get 32-bit applications running on 64-bit Raspberry Pi OS. So 32-bit Dyalog APL will run on 32-bit Raspberry Pi OS, 64-bit Dyalog APL will run on 64-bit Raspberry Pi OS. And classic. Here's a nice, I asked Adam for an expression. So here's a nice bit of APL code. No, here's a bit of APL code anyway, which attempts to, what was it again, Adam? Find letter pairs, that was it, that appear at least 10 times. That's not particularly a lovely piece of code in Unicode. I defy anybody to work out what that means. That is, it's the way we had to effectively implement characters that cannot appear in quad AV in Classic. You end up with these horrible quad U 4 character things. That's one very good reason for getting rid of it. Please, just move off Classic. Make everybody's life easier. Other thing I would say is, particularly going back to HttpCommand, is trying to use things like HttpCommand to get stuff off websites in a Classic interpreter is horrible. You really have to bring them back as integer values, and then you have to convert the integer values to something to do with quad AV if it's character. If you're on a Unicode interpreter, UTF-8 just comes back so much easier. So, we've made a 19.0 user meeting release. It's nothing other than effectively 19.0 as of, I think, 10, 12 days ago. Not everything that I may mention is quite there yet. What I think we can say, 99% certain, is that any workspace saved with this user meeting release will be loadable in the release 19.0, but I wouldn't want to bet on the reverse. You will have to uninstall and reinstall the GA release. Particularly on Windows, we haven't defined the baseline files. Until we have those, you can't patch. So you'll have to uninstall and reinstall to get those baseline files. On the Mac, Morton obviously rather stole my thunder on this slide yesterday, but that's to be expected. We expect 19.0 to be the last version to be built for Intel-based Macs. It runs quite well, as do earlier versions, on ARM-based Macs running under Rosetta. Actually very, very well. But we have, I'm not sure what tense to use here. We have created 19.0 as a native ARM-based application. Whether it's released on the same day as the other 19s for Windows AIX, Mac on Intel, Pi, and whichever one it is I've missed, is a bit, I'm not absolutely certain about this, but if it's not on that day, it will be very soon thereafter. The Mac packaging is a .pkg file, which basically means that we have notarized it and stapled it. That basically means we've pushed it up to an Apple website, and they've said, yep, that looks good enough for us. It's a horrible thing to have to do. It's possibly one of the most sensitive pieces of code we have in our build process. It's not, but it's there, and it means that it's then just another application as far as Apple is concerned. A lot of people, this is alleged, consider Macs to be nothing more than glorified, fancy, fast Linux boxes. So please, can we have something much more akin to the Linux installation? So that is, it's a TTY-based version with a separate RIDE. So we're looking into that. We're looking at a homebrew-based installation process. The files will still be signed, but the package won't be notarized. They're fairly early days and it's still work in progress. Please, if you're interested, can you drop Stefan a note? He's driving this one. What our plans are is when we've actually got something, anyone who shows an interest will probably send them out a note saying, could you have a play with this? What do you think about it? Will we make this available in 19.0? Maybe in the timescale for 19.0, not absolutely certain yet. And of course then comes the question is, do we still want to keep the existing packaging? Well, the answer is certainly for 20, yes. We may review that at some point. I mentioned RIDE. The RIDE user guide is no more. It is dead, Jim. I should avoid doing Monty Python dead parrot comments as well at this point, I think. Instead, you can obtain the documentation is online as markdown at this URL. One of the reasons doing that is we're actually seeing more and more people contributing to RIDE, and it makes more sense to have the RIDE documentation close to the RIDE source code. Of course, if you take the RIDE section of the Dyalog APL for macOS user guide out of the user guide, that becomes very small. I think 3 or 4 pages we estimate. That will be for 19.0. It may mean that future versions of APL, we look at all the non-Windows user guides and shuffle them around a bit. Fee asked me to ask everybody, have you seen the cheat sheets that we include on our documentation center and we include in the help directory of installation directories? Are they of any use? Would you like us to change them? Is there any new one that you would like us to do one about? If you do, Fee's around for the rest of the week, or drop her a note on the subject. Right, and final section as ever, miscellaneous. So, you can now type this. So what? In the past you could type prenedgoo, but nothing more. And the reason is that you might have a piece of code like this, and it's just fallen over, and you type prensi. And what you can now do is you can move up screen, type prened at the beginning of the line, hit enter, and it will open the editor on the object foo and place the cursor on line 1 of the function. Will we do this with quad-ed? Not at the moment, because there's questions about, well, actually, do we want to, first of all, quad-ed, once we change it, it's changed for good because it's in people's code. And secondly, because the left argument specifies things like the type, so we may want to put the line in there. And thirdly, perhaps what we want to do is to allow you to say, I want to put the cursor on this line, on this column. So we're not going to rush to do quad-ed in 19.0. We will certainly do something with it, probably in 20. So this basically means that prened is now brought in line with double-clicking on the name or hitting the edit keystroke. Our customers have asked, or some of our customers asked, or rather said, what we don't like about the log file in Dyalog APL is if I start an APL process and I run it for a long time and I do all sorts of work, and I start another APL and I close this one and I then close this one, the log file has lost all of this information because it's updated with every time an APL terminates. So the last terminated APL is what appears in the log file. And so what we've done is that you can now set the configuration parameter log file to contain a star. I know this isn't where it ends up by default, but I've only got a limited amount of space on the slide. So if you define it to be default_star.dlf, when Dyalog APL, you start a new APL, the first APL session, it will open the file, create it if necessary, the file called default_000.dlf. I start a second APL process. It tries to open that file. Well, it exists, big tick, but it's logged. So it can't use that one, and it goes and creates default_001.dlf. If you don't have the star in there, then APL carries on as it does at the moment, which basically means that every APL uses the same log file and you won't end up with any locking issues. The default for 19.0 will have a star in it. I think we got there on Windows. I think we need to do a bit of work to make it happen on non-Windows platforms. If you want to know what your current log file is, quadse.log file will tell you the current log file that your process is using, whereas prenconfig or 2quadenq get environment log_file will tell you what the actual definition of the configuration parameter is. We've seen quite a lot of examples of multi-line input in the session, and you by default on the Windows version get this nice box characters to indicate that that's a multi-line. We are not enabling that by default on the TTY interface, and the reason is that most people, when they want to copy and paste text in the session on a TTY version, rely on the terminal emulator's ability to select, copy and paste. And of course, if you the line drawing characters are just characters as far as that mechanism is concerned, and what you end up with is a lot of value errors because the line starts with a graphics character. That's a slightly odd thing to want to do. I still don't understand why you want to put a colon if statement in the session, but you may well want to make that a defun. That's a perfectly reasonable thing to do. And then the fuzz test comes along. And this happened last week. It found that if you type that in, you'll get a syserror 6, and that's the end of your APL process. That will be fixed by the time we release 19.0. But it does show that the fuzz tester, although it seems to generate really bizarre expressions, sometimes there's some fairly simple expressions that are very close to those weird expressions that people may type by accident. QuadDR reports the type of the argument as it is held in the workspace after having squeezed the argument. In Dyalog APL, singleton booleans are held effectively as 1-byte integers. Actually, there's two special pockets in the workspace, bool 0 and bool 1. And what that means is that if you query the QuadDR of 2 equals 2, you'll get 83. There's no benefit to marking it as a type 11, it won't save any space. Whereas if you take the QuadDR of 2 equals 23, that's a 2-element bool, that will fit in a single byte, and that will be marked as type 11. QuadDR reports the type of the argument as it is held in the workspace after having squeezed the argument. Except that if you call QuadDR dyadically to change the type of an argument, it is assumed that you want to preserve that type. So, and we set a sticky bit in the zones field, which Richard talked about yesterday, to mark it as having been changed via QuadDR. So if I take the QuadDR of that to there is type 11, convert it to type 323, floats, and if I take the QuadDR of the value, it stays as 323. Trust me, it's extremely difficult to take that sticky bit off. It's super glue. It's not just a bit of flour and water paste. If you want to take that off, generally you actually have to make some change to the array. You may have to take an element off and put it back on or something like that. But just be aware that QuadDR does have these couple of little features in it. Yep, it's that time again. Here's my warning about I-beams. Please always put I-beams in cover functions. This may be of use to people who start using .NET Core in particular, and possibly mainly on non-Windows platforms. It tries to work to do enough to determine whether .NET Core is usable. It also tries to capture the error output. Sometimes if you try to use quad using on non-Windows platforms, then actually call a .NET function or something, you get error messages appearing in the session. We haven't eliminated all of them because some are extremely difficult to eliminate, but now, if you call 2250 ibeam Zilda at the beginning of your application, you will get effectively a 3-element array. And for AIX, you'll always get -1 and 0. So that means there is no .NET and you can't use it, and the message Y. On Windows, by default, you end up with 2, 1, and an empty character vector because it uses .NET Framework, not .NET Core. And on Linux, on a machine where I've installed .NET Core, I'll get a 1, 1, and an empty vector. So, although we cache the result of that when you either call it for the first time or when you first try to access a .NET object, it's a really good idea in your application to call that right at the beginning of your code, because if you don't get 2, 1 and an empty array or 1, 1 and an empty array, there is no point in continuing with your application. You've got to fix the operating system or the configuration first of all. Nice little comment from Vince here, that when we first put this in on a classic interpreter, we didn't quite get the conversion to classic AV right, and as he says, it looks like the information's come back in Klingon. And the other one, for those who see the occasional Apple core and such like, you can now control whether you get Apple cores and what the values are under program control. So if you don't want to drop any Apple cores, you can set max Apple cores, the configuration parameter to 0. You may choose to do it under program control. I recommend that in production, particularly on non-Windows platforms, if at all possible, create a separate file system to put your Apple cores in, and then allow it to create all the Apple cores it wants. It doesn't really matter if that file system fills up. It's a bit more embarrassing if your data file system fills up with Apple cores. And we did actually have one instance with one customer who discovered that there was a bug in the operating system version they were using, and their Apple core basically filled up the file system it was running in. I mean, it wasn't, they were just short of, it wasn't almost full. It basically created about a terabyte Apple core file, and we were scratching our heads going, how on earth did a 12 megabyte workspace create a 1 terabyte Apple core file? And it was actually a bug in the operating system. You've been able to set define what the caption looks like in the Windows APL for some time. You had to put entries in the registry to do that. This is the default one that I use. So when in a clear workspace, CS into quad SE, it tells me it's the major. The version A is 19, version B is 0. The short characters is Unicode. The bits are 64. What's the process ID? What's the workspace ID? What's the short namespace? And if you query quadse.caption at this point, you'll get exactly what the caption looks like. You can now set quadse.caption dynamically. So in this case, I'm changing the caption to be Andy and my process ID. So you can change it as you go along. And actually, when I mentioned the 50,000 currencies, calling HttpCommand 50,000 times, I'd actually just set my caption up to just be a count of the number of times it did it. So it just rolled it through. So it wasn't actually changing my session, it was changing my caption all the time. Slight downside of this for some people may be that if you query the caption once you've set it, is the result is what you set it to. So in the previous slide, it's what appeared in the caption is now what you set it to. And if you do want to find what the current value of the caption is, you can use this quad NA call. That's actually documented in the quad NA documentation anyway. Almost at the end now, you'll be pleased to know. When you use many of the system commands to deal with workspaces, we put out a message that says workspace name saved, whatever the date is. Well, what we've done in 19 is we stuck a comment symbol in there. And that means, in the same way as you can now go up screen, type paren no matter what's around it, and you'll get edit the name in question. You can now move up screen, and put a workspace-related system command in front of Andy's wus in this case, and hit enter, and you don't have to delete the rest of the line. So just a little thing which we think might make your lives easier. If you object to that strongly, please let us know. And I think this is the final bit, quad DMX. This is a plea, two-part plea. The first is to our users. Please, when you report a problem to Dyalog APL, when a primitive or a system command isn't doing system function isn't doing what you want, please, can you supply us with what's in quad DMX? And the full version number of the interpreter you're using. Because this information and this information allows us to check out the source code for, in this case, qfile1.c at revision 47901 and make sure we know exactly which, this is really 4438 that we need to look at, and it allows us to more easily identify what your problem's likely to be. Now, I'll admit, the chances of typing that in correctly without making a typo isn't very high. And of course, the moment you make a typo, your DMX is going to be updated with whatever the result is of you mucking up that expression. So what we often see, suggest at the moment is quad JSON, quad DMX. The output isn't very easy to read, nowhere near as easy as the previous slide, but the chances of you typing that incorrectly are considerably higher. So my plea is to the developers and the people who make these decisions in Dyalog is, please, can we have a DARM suggested quad NV so that I can then, when someone has a problem, to support, say, just type quad DMX, quad NV -2 and copy and paste the output from the session. Many times we need to run that when APL's in a funny state or the environment's wrong, so we can't use anything else other than just typing at the command line. And that's that. So thank you very much for listening. I hope that was of interest. If you want to talk to me, I'm around the rest of the week. I'm always available at that email address, but that's it for me today.